In the beautiful city of Abuja there lived a young man named David. David had a very strong desire for sex. Every night he felt the urge to find a girl on the streets, who he took home with him to spend the night. He couldn't seem to resist the temptation and it became a regular part of his routine. He never liked spending a night alone by himself or with his male friends, so he found companionship in this way. Despite being 34 years old and successful in his career, David struggled with a very strong desire for sex. He took his work very seriously and had achieved financial stability. But this aspect of his personal life really troubled him. Although his friends suggested that he settles down and starts a family. But David had reservations. He dreamed of marrying a girl who is a virgin, but he believed it was nearly impossible to find one in the city where he lived. He noticed that many ladies around were involved in activities like prostitution and casual hookups. On the other side of the city, in a small village called Koru, there lived two poor orphans named Rachel and Grace. They struggled to navigate through life and life was so hard for them. Rachel and Grace relied on each other for support while they shared a close resemblance. Rachel, the eldest, was 26 years old and Grace was just 23 years old. Despite their bond, their path in life was very different. Rachel engaged in prostitution to make ends meet for herself and her sister, while Grace was always home trying to look for the best possible way to help out at home. Because she didn't want to live the kind of lifestyle her sister lived. One day Rachel got really sick with malaria and she couldn't do her job anymore, and there was no money for them to survive on and for her treatment. She asked Grace to do it instead for her. But Grace said no because she didn't want to have sex with strangers. This made Rachel really mad because she felt like Grace was not helping them survive like they had planned to. Rachel got even more upset and told Grace she had to go out to work or move out of the house they both lived in. Grace didn't want to leave, but she stood firm and said she wouldn't change her mind because she wanted to keep her virginity and stick to her beliefs and morals. After much thought, Grace gave in to Rachel's demands as she got ready to leave for the night. Rachel dressed her in her own clothes, necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. Before she left, Grace dressed in very revealing clothes. She stood by the roadside waiting for clients for the night. While she stood by the roadside, an expensive car stopped in front of her and it was David. He asked her how much for a night and Grace, still feeling bitter, reluctantly named the price. Then he invited her to get into the car. Inside the car, David began to touch Grace's legs, complimenting her beauty. Despite her irritation, she tried to smile, pretending to be okay. When they arrived at the hotel, Grace felt very nervous. David suggested they go to a club to have fun before heading to the room, but Grace didn't agree. However, David promised to pay her more money, so she reluctantly accepted to go to the club with him. In the club, David offered Grace a drink, but she refused because she doesn't drink alcoholic drinks and she doesn't know much about these kind of places. David insisted and eventually Grace felt pressure to drink. Grace's main reason for being there in the first place was to avoid being kicked out of the house by her sister. David noticed Grace's timid behavior and he assumed she was new to this kind of work. Grace became very drunk that night and she couldn't function properly, so David decided to take her to the room he had arranged for himself and her. He gently placed her on the bed and then left to freshen up himself. David entered the room and tried to wake Grace up, but she wasn't responding well due to being heavily intoxicated. He then proceeded to undress both himself and her. Grace, in her intoxicated state, managed to protest against David's advances, telling him she was a virgin. However, David dismissed her words, thinking she was just talking because she was drunk. He continued trying to be intimate with her, but Grace kept repeating that she was a virgin and Grace cried out, "I'm not a prostitute, I just needed this money so my sister won't send me away from her house." David got frustrated and he insisted she stop stalking and eventually raised his voice telling her that her payment is on the table and she should keep quiet. Grace finally complied and David proceeded with his actions despite her continued objections. David had never kissed the street girls before. He just went directly inside them without any type of romance, but this time he felt like kissing Grace. He felt she was special and admired her beautiful face. He kissed and romanced Grace, then he went inside her. Though while wearing protection, it was his first time enjoying sex. Her body was tight, not loose like other girls he had been with before. He enjoyed himself before they both slept off. David woke up in the morning expecting to see Grace beside him, but she wasn't there, confused. He looked around the room, but Grace was nowhere to be found. As David got out of bed, he noticed blood everywhere in the bedsheet, his body, and around the room. He was shocked and alarmed when he realized the significance of the stains and what had likely occurred during the night. Despite his initial admiration for Grace, David felt really bad because he realized Grace was telling the truth about being a virgin. He regretted taking her virginity for money. As he walked to the bathroom, he saw Grace's necklace she left behind. David felt really bad about what happened with Grace. He knew he had to find her and apologize, so he quickly got dressed and left the hotel to look for her. Meanwhile, Grace woke up feeling confused and ashamed. She left the hotel in a hurry, not wanting to see David or anyone else from that night again. Feeling really down, Grace went home. She decided to give back the money David had given her to her sister Rachel. Rachel felt happy seeing the huge amount because nobody had ever paid her so much for one night's work, even though her sister's face showed she was hurting. Grace hissed in pain as she walked slowly, feeling discomfort from her encounter with David. She went into the bathroom to take a bath. Seeing her sister's discomfort, Rachel laughed and told her she'd get used to it if she kept doing that kind of job. From the bathroom, Grace rejected Rachel's suggestion firmly, saying she would never do it again. She cried in the shower, feeling cheap and ashamed of what happened the previous night. Meanwhile, David ran to the streets with the necklace hoping to find Grace, but his search was unsuccessful, so he decided to go back home and get ready for work. At work, David couldn't shake off the memory of Grace pleading with him, saying she just needed money and wasn't a street girl. The memory of Grace weighed heavily on him, making him restless throughout the day. After work, he hurried to the spot where he had picked Grace up, hoping to find her there, but she wasn't there to be seen. Desperate to find her, David described Grace to other girls working in the area, but none of them knew her. David realized he didn't know Grace's name, phone number, or even where she lived. The only clue he had was the necklace she had left behind in the hotel room. For 2 whole weeks, David searched for Grace, and it was the hardest time he'd ever faced in his lifetime. Even though he usually couldn't go home every night without being with a woman, he managed to stay away from that for 2 weeks. Grace's beauty, her clear skin, and her innocence stuck in David's mind. After his unsuccessful efforts to find Grace, David decided to return to his normal routine. One evening, while coming back from work, he picked up another street girl from the streets and took her to the hotel. But as soon as she tried to get close to him, it was like he was seeing Grace, and he smiled, but when the new girl touched him, he realized she was different and he felt really irritated. This reaction was really unlike David, as Grace's image clouded his mind. He offered the street girl money to go home, and he decided to hang out with his friends instead. While David was with his friends, he felt down but couldn't bring himself to admit that he was in love with a girl he met on the streets. He knew his friends would tease him about it. One of his friends, Luca, noticed David's mood and tried to cheer him up. When Luca showed him a photo of a beautiful girl on Facebook, David wasn't interested at first, but Luca insisted. When David looked at the photo, he saw Rachel wearing the same necklace that Grace had left behind. He asked Luca to send him the screenshot of Rachel's profile. Later, when David was home, he checked Rachel's profile and saw a picture of her that looked a lot like Grace wearing the same necklace. He felt like he had finally found the person he had been looking for the past 2 weeks. Since Rachel's phone number was on her profile, David decided to take note of it. He tried calling Rachel, but she couldn't answer the call. David decided he would try calling her again the next day. The next day at work, David called Rachel again and she finally picked up the call. "Hello," Rachel answered. "Hi, it's David." He said, "I'm really sorry about what happened the other night. I took your virginity just for money and I feel very terrible about it. I want to see you again and give you back the necklace you left behind." Rachel cleverly realized David was referring to her sister Grace. She played along and asked David how he got her number, and he explained he found it on Facebook. They agreed to meet at the mall to exchange the necklace. David and Rachel made up, although he noticed some differences with Rachel. Compared to Grace, her face was the same. He apologized again and asked her not to go back to the streets again. Rachel explained that she had to do to her aunt's demands. "My aunt will send me out of the house if I don't go to the streets," Rachel replied. "I have nowhere else to go or stay." In response, David offered her enough money to find accommodation and start a business so she wouldn't have to return to the street again. Grateful, Rachel accepted and David gave her a check for a large amount of money before they said their goodbyes. When David got home, he felt a difference in his connection with Rachel compared to Grace. He couldn't shake the feeling that Rachel seemed more exposed. After thinking it over, he assumed it was because they hadn't seen each other over a long time. Rachel went home feeling incredibly excited. "I've hit the jackpot," she said to herself. "Not only will I have to live here, but I'll also be able to get a shop and have a handsome and wealthy guy like David." Rachel was on top of the world. A few days later, she started packing her things in the house. When Grace asked where she was going, Rachel replied aggressively, "I'm finding my own way. I can't keep staying in this dirty place." Grace pleaded with her to at least tell her where she was going, but she refused to share any details. Rachel moved to a new house out of the village and Grace was left there all alone suffering. Rachel started a big clothing and jewelry business. David continues to communicate with Rachel over the phone and he was happy to hear that she was doing well. However, he still felt like something was missing. David decided to take Rachel to his house and showed her where he lived, and to her surprise he lived alone. Rachel's eyes widened and she smiled to herself, realizing that her life had changed for the better. David continues to support Rachel financially so that she wouldn't lack anything at all. One day David arrived at work to find his office in a mess. He called his secretary to inquire why the cleaner hadn't shown up, only to learn that the cleaner had stopped coming. The secretary had quickly tied up the office herself. David instructed her to put up a notice outside the office for the position of a cleaner. Meanwhile, Grace had been searching for a job outside of her village near the city because it was difficult for her to make ends meet since Rachel had left her. When she saw the signboard advert of the cleaner position at David's office, she wasted no time and applied for the job. The secretary asked her to start work the next day. Grace resumed work late the next day and quickly began sweeping the office. When David entered and saw his dusty table, he instructed his secretary to call the new cleaner to clean his table and mop the floor, which she did. As David turned to make a phone call, Grace entered the office to clean the table and chairs. In the process, she accidentally knocked over a file, causing both her and David to bend down to pick it up. Their heads collided, and when they looked at each other, they recognized each other's faces. Shocked to see David, Grace tried to run from the office, but David stopped her by holding her waist from behind. Grace apologized, saying she was sorry for being here. David saw the innocence on her face, the same innocence he had seen the night they had met. Feeling a deep connection as he touched her, David realized there was something special about Grace. He asked her why she was there after he had opened a big shop for her. Grace simply replied, "I'm sorry, sir. Please let me go." While David demanded answers from Grace, Rachel called him. They talked while Grace was in front of him. After the call, David seemed shocked and asked Grace who she was. Grace, shivering with fear, pleaded with him to let her go. David assured her that he wouldn't hurt her and persuaded her to sit down. He then asked her if she had a twin sister, but Grace replied that she only had an elder sister who looked exactly like her and people often mistook them for twins. Still surprised, David asked for her name and she replied, "My name is Grace." David then showed her the photo of her which Luca had sent him earlier. "This necklace you forgot in the hotel room. Is this not you wearing the necklace in this photo?" David asked. Grace replied, "That's my elder sister." "How did you get her photo on your phone?" David replied, "Never mind," and shifted closer to the chair where Grace was sitting. He apologized sincerely for hurting her that night and explained that he had been searching for her ever since. He acknowledged that he had made a mistake by taking her virginity in such a way. He asked Grace to give him a chance to make things right. Grace insisted that he hadn't done anything wrong because he had paid for the services. But David continued to plead for her forgiveness. He then asked for her phone number. But Grace didn't have a phone. When he requested her home address, she explained that the place didn't have an address despite their conversation. Grace expressed her desire to continue her job because she had other offices to clean. David picked up the rug and threw it away, telling Grace that she wouldn't work as a cleaner anymore. He then took her to buy a phone and accompanied her back home. When they arrived, David noticed photos of Grace and Rachel on the wall and the poor condition of the room. As he was going through the photos, the landlord arrived to throw Grace's belongings out of the house because she had owed rent for almost 5 months now. Despite David's attempt to reason with the landlord, he refused to listen. In response, David gathered Grace's belongings and took her to his own home. Grace was so emotional. When she moved in with David, she was grateful for his help. But she also felt a little bit uncomfortable with the idea. David really wanted to assist Grace, however he noticed that Grace seemed uncomfortable staying in his house for even a day. So he decided to find her a better place to stay. He called his lawyer to help arrange for the house. While David was talking to his lawyer, Grace walked in unexpectedly. David quickly ended the call and told the lawyer he would call back later. Curious, Grace asked why David was doing so much for her when she had nothing to offer in return. David reassured her that he didn't expect anything in return and that he just wanted her to relax herself. But Grace, feeling uncertain, cleared the air that if David brought her here just to be intimate with her, then she couldn't stay. David responded firmly, saying he called his lawyer to find her a better place for accommodation, and he confessed his feelings for Grace, saying that he liked her a lot and he was even in love with her after that night. However, he emphasized that he wouldn't force her to accept his feelings. Instead, he promised to assist her regardless of their relationship status. The next day, David and Grace went to see different apartments. David said he would pay for whichever one Grace liked best. They visited a few places, but Grace didn't like any of them, even though the apartments they saw were all nice and costly. Grace felt like she could trust David. She felt safe around him and started thinking about staying with him in his house. David and Grace went back to his house. He promised that he would go apartment hunting again the next day, so she could choose the one she liked. But Grace surprised him by saying she wanted to stay in the house with him. She asked him to promise not to be physical with her. David smiled with excitement and said, "I'm grateful you trust me. I won't come close except you want me to." Grace smiled and replied, "So you still want to get close with my consent?" David responded sarcastically, saying, "Yes, because I love you so much. You changed my lifestyle. Since that day we met in the hotel, I stopped womanizing. I couldn't go a day without touching a woman before. But you indirectly and directly turned me away from all men." David was curious about Grace's background, so he asked her to share more about herself. He wanted to know where she grew up, about her family, and what happened that made her end up on the streets that day. Grace shared with David that both her parents had passed away a while back, leaving her with just her and her elder sister. Life in their village was tough, so they decided to move to the city to try to make a living. They had a plan to work hard, but unfortunately, her sister ended up on the streets. Despite this, her sister always took care of the bills. However, on the day she ended up on the streets, her sister was sick and unable to work. She felt pressured to go out and hustle to make ends meet. Her sister even threatened to kick her out if she couldn't go. With nowhere else to go, she had no choice but to join her sister on the street. As Grace recounted her story, tears filled up in her eyes. David felt a wave of empathy for her and put her into a comforting embrace. As she cried while sharing her difficult experience, Grace also asked David while he was womanizing. He explained that many women were interested in him because of his money and some even deceived him. Since then, he felt that, instead of being with women who are only interested in his wealth, it would be better to pick girls from the streets. He believed that they might be more genuine and not after his money. Grace comforted David and they shared a comforting hug. Meanwhile, it had been a week since Rachel had been trying to reach David, but he refused to answer her because he knew she was an imposter. Despite his avoidance, Rachel decided to pay him a visit at his house. Grace and David had become good friends after their hard talk. Grace felt safer with him and he appreciated her trust. One day while they were relaxing at David's house, there was a knock on the door. David went to answer it and to his surprise, it was Rachel. Rachel looked shocked to see Grace in David's house. She looked at Grace suspiciously. "Why are you here?" she asked sharply. Grace felt scared. "I am staying with David," she replied quietly. Rachel softened a little, but still seemed angry while she asked. Grace glanced at David for help. "David is helping me find a place to stay," she explained. "I didn't have anywhere else to go." Rachel seemed a bit calmer. Then she turned to David looking angry again. "Why did you bring her here?" she demanded. David said, "I'm helping Grace." He said she needed a place to stay. David replied with a serious look. "Since you left her and you are pretending to be her," he said. Grace furrowed her brows in confusion. "Pretending to be me?" she asked. David explained how Rachel had pretended to be Grace, but he was relieved that he finally found the real Grace. Before Grace could fully understand, Rachel tried to put her away, insisting they go to her house. But Grace refused and David stepped in to protect her. "Leave her alone, Rachel," David said firmly. Rachel glared at Grace, threatening to deal with her later. Before storming out of the house feeling furious that Grace might take David away from her. When Rachel got home, she decided to visit her uncles and aunts in the village, to seek their help in evicting Grace from David's house. So she journeyed to the village and lied to her relatives, who had never helped them before, to come and take Grace away from David. They all agreed and arrived in the city with Rachel. She took them to David's house, but unfortunately he wasn't there. Grace opened the door and welcomed her aunts and uncles. When they entered the house, knowing David would be a very rich man, so they wanted to strike a deal that would benefit them, not Rachel. The aunts and uncles spoke amongst themselves and agreed to wait for David to return. However, Rachel was impatient and wanted them to forcefully remove Grace from the house. But because of their own selfish interest, they realized that, if they took Grace out and David returned without seeing her, he might report them to the police. Grace decided to call David to come home, due to an emergency, and he rushed home, only to find a lot of strangers in his house. He greeted them and they introduced themselves as Grace's paternal relatives. They told David they came to take Grace away, because it was against their tradition for a girl to stay in the same house with a man who wasn't her husband. David replied, "I'm sorry about breaking your tradition, but I would really love to marry Grace." When Rachel heard this, she got very angry. The uncles and aunts replied to David, "Now you are talking." They invited David to their village to take the list for marriage arrangements. Rachel told her uncles and aunts that this wasn't the reason she invited them. She invited them to evict Grace from the house, but now they were arranging a marriage. David promised Grace's family that he would come to their village in 3 days' time to take the list and make necessary arrangements. Grace's paternal family were happy and he gave them a large sum of money to cover their transportation expenses home. This made Rachel very angry and furious because her plans had backfired on her. After Rachel and her relatives left David's house, Grace confronted him about why he had promised to go to the village and take the marriage list without asking for her consent first. David replied, "That's the best thing I could think of. Grace became angry and walked out of the sitting room after a heated argument with David. David went to her room to talk to her, expressing his deep feelings and desire to be her husband. He pleaded with her, telling her that he loved her and promised never to hurt her again. But Grace refused, and David, feeling defeated, thought that he would return to his old ways. He left her room, but Grace ran after him and held him from behind, telling him not to go. She refused, saying that she really liked him too and had grown to love him. Finally, she agreed to marry him. Hearing Grace's words made David incredibly happy.